Good morning, rabies and germs, and welcome to the Halloween edition of the Outer Frame podcast. And I have a lot I want to talk about, a lot of Halloween-related content. This includes reviews of the new film Goosebumps 2: Haunted Halloween. As a horror fan, one of the most prevalent films I wanted to talk about was the new film Halloween, but with work and other engagements, I've been too preoccupied to write out a full-fledged review on the new film yet. I do intend to do so as soon as the opportunity arises. Maybe I'll have an Outer Frame episode dedicated to looking at the Halloween series, including the new film. Some other films I'll be reviewing include The First Purge and The Nun, both of which are very recent horror films as well. I didn't skip out on video games either, as I intend to share my thoughts on both Agony and The Evil Within 2. This month I also saw the new Venom film, and although I certainly have my fair share of thoughts about that film, I wanted to do a superhero-centered podcast later in November dedicated to Venom, the new Spider-Man video game released by Insomniac, and the new season of Daredevil. That said, although I won't be doing the Halloween review until sometime in November, I won't be doing the Venom reviews until sometime in November, you can always go to mishmashers.com, and on the Mix and Mash podcast, that's the podcast I do with my fiancée Becca Grace, and we actually sit down and we talk about Venom and Halloween, so make sure to check that out. In late September, my brother and I attended the Saluki Comic Con in Carbondale, Illinois, alongside many other artists, spanning from various platforms. I wouldn't say I was nervous about the convention itself, but I recognized it as another important goal for ourselves. Our novel, The Kane's Files, was published in May of this year, marking Scott's written debut and my fourth novel. I've since also published Catalina the Hollow on Kindle and paperback as well. We've tried numerous different avenues in trying to build publicity and momentum for our novel, which had consisted prior of attending a smaller comic and toy expo. I try my best not to seem braggadocious when I talk about our achievements, and in general, I like to try and be as transparent as I can. Scott and I aren't established names in the industry, and I think that it's a unique time capsule when I am direct and honest about our accomplishments on this podcast. At the Comic and Toy Expo we attended, Scott and I were able to sell 16 paperback copies of The Kane's Files priced at $7 a piece. Our goal wasn't to achieve a profit, nor was it to break even for all our hefty expenses, but instead it was to garner some attention and publicity for ourselves. At the Saluki Comic Con, our expenses have only increased, and while I only ended up selling a little more than what I did from the much smaller expo, I think it was a lot more beneficial. In particular, whereas in the last expo, we had a home field advantage, which frankly accounted for at least half of our sales. This time, we sold 20 books at our table to strangers, which is important, because, like, you know, at the other toy expo, there was a lot of people going like, hey, you wrote a book, and then they bought it to be nice, but it wasn't necessarily people that were gonna, I highly doubt any of the people that bought it, that knew me, actually read The Kane's Files. Like, they do it to be nice, but at the same time, it doesn't really help us achieve our goals. Like, I appreciate it, but really what we're looking for is feedback and support. I think of most of it as a learning experience, and I think we'll be able to apply a lot of what we've learned in making for certain our next go-around is successful. Specifically, next time, I think we'll invest in our presentation, which in the previous conventions only consisted of a blown-up framed cover of The Kane's Files and a whiteboard we crudely took turns jotting down asinine illustrations on. I think next time we'll invest in a proper backdrop and a more carefully calculated aesthetic. One thing I was somewhat leery about was in regards to how well Catalina the Hollow would sell. Unlike the novel I wrote with Scott, I didn't think Catalina would have an appeal to everyone at the comic conventions. Something else I was a little bit apprehensive about was the reaction to Catalina's subject matter, and what that would be. Although I still haven't gotten a lot of feedback to what people thought of it, and so I suppose that insecurity still remains. Catalina is a dark novel, with roots in human trafficking and some very serious, heavy subject matter. I try not to pull any punches with my depictions, and while I remain very proud of my fifth novel, I know it won't be for everyone. That said, to my surprise, of the 20 copies we sold at the Saluki Comic Con, 11 of them were for Catalina the Hollow, which is very cool. Besides Catalina the Hollow, I also brought my fiancée Becca Grace along for the ride, a person you might be familiar with on the Mix and Mash podcast, which is where oftentimes I talk about the films I review on Outer Frame in a looser, more improvisational manner. She dressed as characters from Undertale over the weekend, whereas I half-assedly dressed as Kaneki from Tokyo Ghoul. I didn't want to look like a sex slave S&M character while trying to sell my books. The year isn't over yet, but where it stands, I've actually already achieved the landmark I set for myself in the very first edition of the Outer Frame podcast, if you recall, which was 50 copies sold. As of October 31st, I have sold 6 copies of The Kane's Files on the Kindle and 28 copies of The Kane's Files on paperback. I have also sold 4 copies of Catalina the Hollow on the Kindle and 11 copies of Catalina the Hollow on paperback, along with a single copy of Catherine Forever with Love on the Kindle. Although it might not seem like very much, I am very grateful I've been able to share my work with anyone at all, and I thank everyone who supported me in trying to fulfill my lifelong dream. That said, good morning and happy Halloween! Let's start with our first video game review for the podcast, Agony. Agony was released on PC, the Xbox One, and PlayStation 4 on May 29, 2018, after a successful Kickstarter campaign in late 2016. The development and release practices are worth acknowledgement. Originally scheduled for a release on March 30th, 2018, Agony was delayed nearly a full 2 months after set date. The bigger story, however, is what happened upon its release. Critics and gamers alike have ranted and raved in regards to the product they received, citing a plethora of glitches and bugs, many of which have since been patched by developer MadMind Studio. Although one should certainly expect a finished product for something they're paying a full retail price for, in some instances, it's the nature of the beast that some mistakes are made with a video game of this scale and a developer this small. Because of this, I waited several days before purchase, and lo and behold, MadMind Studio rolled out several patches in response to the outage. Again, consumers should be able to expect a finished product, but when many AAA title video games receive large patches on launch, it's difficult to kick down MadMind Studio. In a lot of ways, I had sympathies for the developer. Agony's development and the release that subsequently followed depicted the studio in over their depth. The Kickstarter campaign and how it was handled has also been less than what's ideal. Look no further than the Kickstarter's comment section and you'll find how hurt many of the backers feel in regards to how they've been treated. Someone who backs a Kickstarter campaign shouldn't blast a game developer if they deliver what was advertised, even if said game isn't on par with their expectations. Constructive and even venomous criticisms perhaps, but not saying a developer stole from them because their investments didn't pay off. But in this instance, with backers complaining they haven't received the game they backed, even though it had been available to public at large for weeks now, that's when blasting becomes justifiable. From the looks of it, MadMind Studio had a lot of complications, be it from bad planning or unforeseen circumstances. But nevertheless, I think many will think twice before they back the studio again because of it. I had hopeful expectations for Agony, enough so that I bought a copy even after the reviews took a nosedive. I'm a fan of the horror genre, and I've always thought the aesthetic of hell made a grotesque and unique perspective for a horror game. I really enjoyed the setting shown in Dante's Inferno, for instance. In Agony, players play as a tormented soul with no recollection of the past. In some instances, it feels as though more backstory can be pieced together about the character's past. From the names Nimrod and Amraphel, it's inferred you might have been a king in the land of Shinar, but nothing significant ever substantiates. The only real apparent objective with Agony is that you must trudge through hell and confront the Red Goddess. Ultimately, the storyline throughout Agony is one-dimensional fodder that only adds a frame to the illustration Agony wants to create for itself. In general, this isn't a death sentence, especially for a horror game, as many games like Silent Hill benefit from the simplicity behind their narrative, allowing the atmosphere, visuals, and the player's imagination to flourish. Unfortunately, the characters you encounter in Agony aren't simply one-dimensional, but they're bad, with the characters spouting generic, repetitive lines executed through awkward delivery. The gameplay in Agony is comparable to Alien Isolation or Outlast, with AI monstrosities wandering about, ready to kill you, usually in a single hit. If by some chance you are killed by an enemy, you then enter a spiritual view for a limited amount of time, allowing you to possess a weaker-minded body and continue with a second wind. A lot of the major criticisms I had in regards to Agony were fixed early on. It can oftentimes be difficult to figure out where you're meant to go. That's an obstacle amplified because of how dark and obscured everything is. On the bright side of that, however, exploration can be enjoyable, with many different collectibles and secret chambers hidden around the robust area. Fortunately, in a patch, Agony made things so you could use unlimited destiny lines to always find where you're meant to go, or not. It's optional. Something else I very much disliked was a feature in Agony that deleted your latest checkpoint if you died 3 times in a row, which could sometimes send you back a great ways, but once more, that is now optional as well. At its best, Agony is enjoyable, and at the heart of it, I don't think I hate the gameplay as many of the reviews would suggest, even if it isn't what I would call good. Traversing through the levels, the moments when I could chew on the scenery, and the instances where everything functioned the way it was intended, it's clear that some real inspiration went into its development. Something that appealed to me about Agony is that it wasn't a walking simulator. I don't mean that as derogatory, because I had been seeing a lot of them in the horror genre as of late, and while I enjoy games like Layers of Fear, if I had to choose, I'd prefer a video game that incorporates more traditional gameplay elements. However, after fully experiencing Agony, I find myself thinking a lot of the gameplay elements were undesirable. and that it would have worked better if it was more linear and focused more on the atmospheric and cinematic presentation already at the forefront. The melee combat is mostly an afterthought in Agony, unless you possess a succubus or some other creature, which you can only do for a short window of time, and your vision is obscured by a bad color-tinted layer. Most of the gameplay is puzzle solving and stealth. The stealth is undercooked and doesn't work very well with the environment. I found myself constantly stopped by invisible barriers when I tried to sneak around enemies, and I found that while I held my breath, enemies would continuously make a beeline in my direction. Enemies that had once walked in larger patterns would condense and start walking only specifically around where I was, even though I hadn't alerted them, which in narrow hallways goes hand in hand with what I said earlier about being stopped by invisible barriers. Sometimes I would even get caught on these invisible barriers and I wouldn't be able to carry on, forcing myself to restart from a previous checkpoint. Meanwhile, the puzzle system was repetitive. Although I remember a couple instances I'd single out, for the most part, a lot of the puzzle progression had most to do with finding body parts to sacrifice at shrines, which meant a lot of running around to fetch items again and again and again. One enemy in particular that crawls around is one of the most annoying I've ever encountered in a video game of all time. It almost never kills you, but it will follow you around, constantly tackling you off your feet. The atmosphere and its depictions are, without doubt and as expected, the most redeeming aspect of Agony and something I would partly recommend, but even it comes with certain caveats. Right off the bat, the graphics in Agony are dated, looking like something from the early days of the Xbox 360. A lot of the imagery in Agony feels inspired, and I think it's a lot of the reasons why most were so interested in Agony in the first place. A lot of what was suggested in the early trailers bleeds out in the actual game. It's a nice, slimy depiction of hell, but is also one that is very cluttered, inconsistent, and one that, at times, feels like it tries to coast off of a shocking concept more than a shocking execution. For instance, there's a scene that involves a wall being made out of dead babies, but for some reason, maybe because of the voice acting, maybe because of the graphics themselves, it carries a low-budget B-movie comedic schlock, which is a weird vibe to get from a wall made out of dead babies. It feels like it has the goods and willingness to freely express itself, but it feels like it hasn't given enough thought on how to express its ideas well. So many different sculptures and paintings can be found in Agony. Suffice to say, it has concept art to spare. But in the end, you're left with 3, maybe 4 actual demons to encounter throughout the whole experience, one of them feeling very standard, and one of them being that super annoying character I talked about earlier. And so little is done with any of them. To keep from further beating a dead horse, Agony is bad. I don't hate Agony in such a scathing fashion as so many do, because I feel like I have a higher tolerance of a bad game when it's horror, since it's my bread, but I recognize it has very large, significant problems. I haven't had my bridge burned with Mad Mind Studio personally, so I hope they end up reevaluating and approach this as a learning experience. I just won't consider investing in their Kickstarter or buying their game on launch. That said, I give it a rating of 3 out of 10. Next on the chop block, taking a look at a horror film, here are my thoughts on The Nun. The Conjuring series arrived unexpectedly in 2013, although in retrospect it seemed like we should have anticipated it. James Wan had already flourished and found success with the Saw franchise, the Insidious franchise, and had more than a handful of horror productions on his resume. It was only a matter of time before he had such a financially and critically lucrative breakthrough. In the 2000s, very few horror films have managed to cross the 300 million threshold. Even less if you admit series that only share strands of the genre's DNA like The Meg or World War Z. It only leaves The Conjuring and The Conjuring 2, the more recent adaptation of Stephen King's It, Annabelle Creation, and now The Nun. A film series managing to outdo itself in the horror genre so many times is unheard of, and while the series may have peaked with the original film from a critical standpoint, although my favorite of the series remains The Conjuring 2, the Conjuring universe really is the first time we've ever seen an established horror world since the loose threads that connected the Universal monster films of yesteryear. Similar to the Annabelle films, which spun off from the first Conjuring film, The Nun is a film adapted after its introduction in The Conjuring 2. The Nun is a gothic supernatural horror film directed by Corin Hardy and written by Gary Dauberman. Dauberman is a screenwriter I feel like I've talked a lot about on Mishmashers.com, as he also received a credit for the new It film and Annabelle Creation. Corin Hardy is otherwise known for his directorial work on The Hollow, a film I have seen but for the life of me can't recall anything about. Set in Romania, the film follows a Roman Catholic priest and a nun in training as they look to inquire information about a nun that has committed suicide. The film is a period piece set in 1952 and stars Damien Beicher, Tessa Farmiga, and Jonas Bloquet. Something interesting of note is that Tessa Farmiga is the daughter of Vanessa Farmiga, star actress from the Conjuring film series. Something worth mentioning is that prior to this review, I also did a half-hour discussion with Becca Grace on the Mix and Match podcast, where we shared our opinion on The Nun. Our opinions on the film still had to be digested, although I do think what I said about the film on that podcast aligns well with what I have to say on Out of Frame. Keep in mind that the discussion isn't spoiler-free, whereas this review will hold back on pertinent details. I've never been the biggest fan of supernatural films related to exorcisms or ghost-related subject matter. I think this goes back to the paranormal activity films and films like Annabelle, which arguably depend too heavily on cheap scares and dated parlor tricks. In the horror genre, it's commonly accepted that what goes unseen in the film can often be scarier than what is shown. This is a method of thinking I believe has been exploited over the years. If you have a good idea for a film and have enough talent to bring that idea to fruition, it will usually amount to a good film. But what I think is done a lot with the horror genre is the recycling of old, dated horror tropes and ideas. If a film has a low budget, it usually exploits this mindset. However, there's a fine line between slow burn and having a gun that's firing blanks. The Nun isn't absolved of sin, but something worth commending about the film is that it does deliver some imagery and ideas I think are worthy of acknowledgement. The scares aren't that of a horror maestro, but I did walk away from the film thinking that some unique ideas and creative uses of the environment made their way into the film. And that can often be a rarity in mainstream horror. The film has received fair criticism on account of its use of jump scares, but I found them tamer than the worst of the genre, and I'm thankful they at least had some ideas hand in hand with the jump scares. Some of the ideas can be easy to telegraph. In one scene it shows bells dangling by strings near tombstones, a feature added for when persons are mistakenly pronounced dead. Just mentioning the fact they acknowledge such a detail is enough to predict what's likely to happen next. Even if you can predict its best moments beat by beat, I will say they're cool ideas and the film does try and add some unique flavor to them. The actors in this film are commendable and solid through and through, whereas The Conjuring's premiere spinoff Annabelle featured actors that, in my opinion, could be referred to as cookie cutter. This film has actors more on par with the main series. Damien Beicher delivers strongly as the front and center everyman, and Tessa Farmiga isn't a slouch either. One or more of the lines of the film might have been hokier than I would have liked, especially a line dialogue from Jonas Bloquet later in the film where I feel like they undermine the nun with a tonally inconsistent comedic line, but I would consider it decent overall. They are complemented as well by nicely created set pieces, which depict familiar imagery but do so very well. The music, lighting, and cinematography, through and through, I would say are all very solid technique from individuals very skilled and knowledgeable of the craft. The film doesn't feel like it held out, and I felt like it had an actual vision for what it wanted to accomplish. Granted, what it wanted to accomplish wasn't fully unique or innovative, but it does capture an atmosphere and identity. And even if that identity isn't necessarily distinguishable, at least we can say that it was realized. Cemeteries with large, white wooden crosses may always look beautiful in the night, but you can only see a preacher spouting jargon to vanquish the evil so many times before it starts to feel played out. I'm thinking that happened sometime in the 80s. The most unfortunate aspect about The Nun, however, and why I think it has received the negative reviews it has, is because it never really develops a strong narrative for its central conflict, failing to lure us in through its antagonist. Not only that, but it fails to provide any biting development for its ready-to-go cast. The film succeeds more as a treatment of a horror film than it does an actual horror movie. It has the talented cast, and they even deliver solid performances, but they're not given engaging dialogue to work with. They have the atmosphere and the set pieces, but the nun isn't able to engage as the antagonist. I don't think the nun necessarily deserves the damning response it has received, and I do think it's head and shoulders better than the first Annabelle. In fact, I think it's on par with Annabelle Creation, but I think it has problems that keep it far short from sainthood. It's an above average 6 out of 10 horror film, but it doesn't particularly warrant a recommendation. Okay, next in the chop block, let's look at the second video game of the podcast. Let's look at The Evil Within 2. When The Evil Within first arrived in 2014, myself and many others were very excited. Directed by Shinji Mikami, developer Tengo Gameworks' new survival horror appeared poised to replace the Resident Evil-shaped hole in our hearts left when Capcom's Resident Evil 6 found itself unable to meet expectations. The Evil Within arrived and received a generally positive critical reception, although unfortunately not the caliber of acclaim many would have hoped. From my perspective, I recognize The Evil Within as suffering from its fair share of flaws, whether it be dated graphics or the fact that bullets tended to magically traverse enemies instead of, shooting them. That said though, I really loved The Evil Within, and played through the campaign on 4 separate occasions, enjoying the thematic elements, the memorable antagonist. I think The Evil Within, while not the action survival adventure brought to us with Resident Evil 4, is one of the best pure horror video games I've played. Suffice to say, I was very excited and very, very surprised when The Evil Within 2 was announced for release October 2017. Set 3 years after The Evil Within, Sebastian Castellanos has left the Crimson City Police Department but still finds himself troubled by the experiences he had in Beacon. After his daughter's supposed demise in a house fire, His wife Myra leaves him, and Sebastian, left alone with his thoughts, resorts to alcoholism. That is, until his former partner and Mobius agent Julie Kidman contacts him and reveals that Lily is indeed alive and in need of assistance. Told that Lily has been being used as the core for a new STEM system called Union, Sebastian is plugged into STEM and tasked with locating his daughter. Something I've noticed over the years I've spent as a fan of the Resident Evil series, a series Evil Within acts as a blood relative to, is how much they struggle on delivering characters and storyline on a thoughtful, genuine level. Part of the reason Resident Evil 6 was so often ripped apart is because the cinematic approach it took. Simply put, what I've noticed is that Resident Evil, like Evil Within, works best when it doesn't try to bog itself down too much with humanity's involvement in their world. Stick with the atmosphere and the gameplay itself, everything else can afford to take a back seat, because in Evil Within 2, from a storyline perspective, it can often feel more cliched than what I'd like. The Evil Within 2 plays it a lot like its predecessor, although it brings some new elements to the series we hadn't seen prior. While Evil Within 2 isn't an open-world survival horror per se, it does have robust, non-linear hubs that encourage exploration and occasional side objectives. Although many might enjoy this aspect, the moments I found myself most immersed by were the more contained occurrences. The side missions feel inconsequential and otherwise uninspired, but they're enjoyable as well. Ultimately, I'd call it a standard open world that may bring new elements to the series, but brings nothing new to the genre itself. The gameplay remains largely unchanged, as is the way you interact and face off against enemies. It remains enjoyable, and there remains fun to be had, whether it be engaging enemies through stealth or a more direct approach. Like its predecessor, however, the Evil Within 2 suffers from a lack of polish. It's difficult to accurately explain, but the shooting and its blend with the over-the-shoulder perspective feels awkward in a way that wasn't felt in the Resident Evil video games or even the Evil Within game prior. At least I didn't have any issues with headshots failing to connect because shots went through enemies, however. Something I loved about the Evil Within is something largely missed in the Evil Within 2, and it's the antagonist. Everything feels very conventional this time around. Even if the original may have suffered from different flaws, at least when the Executioner wreaked havoc, he commanded a certain presence, and when Ruvik wandered the library, he cast the shadow of a looming threat. In the Evil Within 2, one of the most distinctive characters seen is a character named Stefano, a deranged artist that desires to create art out of mutilating and posing his victims. If this sounds familiar to you, don't worry, it's because it's a character that has been done in some form about 100 times now. Atmospherically, the Evil Within 2 remains on point, even if it isn't depicting imagery as uniquely imagined as I would have liked. The sound and music design suggest a robust grandeur that simply isn't felt with what we're experiencing with the game itself. I didn't want to keep comparing the Evil Within 2 to its predecessor because I wanted to be able to talk about it on its own merit, but it's actually irrelevant to mention. My favorite aspect of the Evil Within 2 is a throwback made to its predecessor. From a structural standpoint, it can be also argued that Evil Within 2 is more straightforward and simpler, answering the criticisms made about the first's complicated, perhaps overzealous nature. In my opinion, though, I found that abstract surrealism added a lot to the Evil Within's mystique. At its worst, the Evil Within 2 storyline is predictable and cliché. At its best, it is enjoyably satiating and competent. Evil Within 2 isn't a bad video game, however it doesn't offer very many unique original ideas. It's a follow-up that fails to match its predecessor, and fails to make much out of its fantastic concept. It definitely has glimmers of inspiration sprinkled in. The Theodore Wallace character was interesting for what we saw of him, even if his philosophies seemed superficial. The Guardian, otherwise known as the Big Chainsaw Lady, encounters posed some enjoyable moments, and the song that closes the Evil Within 2, which is also what was seen in the trailers, is one of my favorite songs in a video game. Unfortunately, it simply takes things in a very different direction compared to the first, and this direction deviates drastically from what appealed to me, and the new direction only provides glimmers of what originally brought Evil Within to the dance. In the end, I will go ahead and say that it is an above-average video game, giving it a 6 out of 10. Alright, next to the chop block is the First Purge. The Purge arrived in 2013, bolstering the brilliant premise of an event in time where all crime would be considered as legal. I think we can all admit that a lot of horror franchises tend to milk themselves for all they're worth, or overstay their welcome. But every now and again, a concept like the Purge arrives that makes sense for the long haul. The possibilities and angles you could take the Purge are virtually limitless. It could implement elements of a home invasion horror, which is something we saw in the original film, or incorporate traits of a slasher flick, something seen on some level in the fourth film. It has a lot of ways you could tackle it, but one way, from what we've seen so far, it can't be tackled, is very well. When the first film arrived, it squandered the potential its concept had, and as I wrote in my review on Mishmashes at the time of its release, it amounted to a below-average film. In 2014, I believe they righted their wrongs on some level. Although the Purge Anarchy opted for a more action-oriented approach, It at least was able to capture a liveliness and did attempt to realize its concept. My favorite scene from the film involved a swinging pendulum that nearly kills the main character, and when it doesn't, it's met with disappointed reactions from the perpetrators. The reason I liked it is because that's what I wanted from The Purge as a series, a depraved world that doesn't understand the extent of its misdeeds, and allows for a day of uncontrolled chaos. Not only that, but I believe the aesthetic and the amount of people involved would have made fodder for some intense and inspired horror. Imagine a scene where the main protagonist is being chased around by a madman. The camera pans out far enough to show several people are experiencing the same thing at the same time, or escaping one madman only to find another. The concept really made sense, and even if I only rated Purge Anarchy as above average in my review on Mishmashers, I was very invested and excited about what it could possibly pave the way for. It was then, however, in 2016 that the Purge election year officially ended any level of excitement or expectation I had of the series. The characters participating in the Purge were ridiculously over the top and cheesy, and not only that, but it simply wasn't a very fun film. If I had to narrow it down to one singular issue I had with the series, it's that it had such a surrealist concept, and yet, instead of exploiting that concept as a means to make bone-shattering, self-contained, and unique horror, it opts to spend most of its time explaining itself, trying to make sense out of something when the answer is so ham-fisted and uninteresting. Regardless, I always knew the Purge series would carry on. While the Purge fell only a small amount shy of $90 million at the box office, Anarchy was able to cross the 100 million threshold, and Election Year was able to barely surpass Anarchy, grossing nearly 120 million worldwide. Each year the series surpasses itself, and with the first Purge making nearly 140 million worldwide, I don't anticipate this will be the last we see of the franchise in theaters. The first Purge is liberating in some respect. Theoretically speaking, it allows the franchise to free itself from the shackles of its convoluted and political narrative, opting instead to focus on the audacity of its concept as it's implemented. Unfortunately, that doesn't really happen. Once more, like what plagues much of the series, the first Purge is very heavy-handed with its political undertones. Unable to really conceal itself through nuance, it'd much rather beat you over the head with its themes and agenda. I think what I would prefer to see from the series at any point is a random year of the Purge, not focusing on anything except the survival of its characters. Then again, I understand the series' marketing campaign has often directly exploited its political themes, and that might very well be why the series is the only horror that has had its films improve on themselves from a box office perspective 3 consecutive times. After watching the first Purge, I can say with the fullest certainty that I believe it is an improvement over Election Year. But is it a good film? The film once more focuses a lot more on why it chooses to legalize the Purge and the scrutiny that ensues thereafter in its regard. I will say that I like the way the film tries to provide answers and present a plausible explanation for itself. The concept of overpopulation and finite resources is a conversation relevant in today's age, and the film continues to double down on the idea that the new founding fathers of America are targeting the lower middle class. The first Purge is an experiment on Staten Island, and although many citizens decide to leave before the Purge ensues, the NFFA convinces many people to stay by offering a financial reward of $5,000 as well as further compensation for active participation in the experiment. I think this was a clever touch, although I will mention the film does have some screwball dialogue that leaves some to be desired. It isn't anything as bad as the candy bar nonsense from the last film, but I do remember one of the activists spouting that they wouldn't be coaxed into the Purge and that the NFFA knew full well poor people would stay if they were offered financial compensation. Yeah, that's kinda why they did it. They offered money so people would stay, knowing that people who need money would stay. And while saying you won't be coaxed into it, you are in fact playing right into their hand. It was just a really stupid line. There's a few stupid lines in this movie. There's 4 stories at play worth acknowledging when talking about the film's plot. There's the bigwigs monitoring the Purge who need it to be a success and are willing to exert themselves to make that happen. An angry teenager who is desperate for financial gain to free himself and his sister from their shoddy living conditions. That is actively trying to target a person named Skeletor. That person, Skeletor, is a crazed drug addict who is actively partaking in the Purge in order to engage in a killing spree, which is the 3rd central story in the film's plot. And finally, we have our main protagonist, Dimitri, a gang leader who finds himself in a position to protect the citizens of Staten Island. The intermingling storylines, although nothing to write home about, are mostly fine. Isaiah being angry and at the same time having too much of a moral conscience to kill is a familiar but finely executed theme, and it's expected, but fine as well, that the NFFA would be involved in tampering with the result of the Purge experiment. As for Skeletor, that character borders in the same unlikable territory as what was seen in Election Year, seeming over the top and cartoonish. Dimitri's character, or more specifically, Yailan Noel, the actor who played him, is actually my favorite part about the film, because I feel he had a very likable and charismatic personality to him that elevated the film overall. Whether a gang leader would have the altruism or loyalty to his city to protect them and expend his gang members to do so is neither here nor there, but the portrayal of the character did feel consistent and authentic. The film doesn't offer much in the way of enticing visuals or memorable, distinguishable moments worthy of being singled out. A lot of that is because the film tries more at being an action film than it does a horror. That said, it doesn't offer a lot of action worth singling out either. I would call it a very conventional and standard in that regard, akin to the rest of the series. In conclusion, the First Purge isn't to the Purge election year the knee-jerk reaction that the Purge Anarchy was after the awful first film in the series, but it is a considerable improvement in terms of sheer functionality. It still makes a lot of the same mistakes that plagued the series, but I think it amounts to an average film overall. Below the Purge Anarchy and above the first film, I never actually wrote a review of Election Year, but with that film being my least favorite, you can imagine that this film is considerably better. Alright, last up on the Halloween edition of the Out of Frame podcast, we're taking a look at Goosebumps 2 Haunted Halloween. Nostalgia is very powerful in the entertainment industry. As film companies try to appeal to the youth, they simultaneously try to appeal to adults in search of that childlike wonder they felt in their youth. In 2015, a big screen feature film, Goosebumps, was released, and I was on board. I enjoyed the R.L. Stine's novels as a kid. A lot of them were derivative and hastily rushed onto bookshelves, but I did have an appreciation and respect for the way R.L. Stine brought old-school monster stories and made them relevant and engaging to a younger audience. It was for that reason a Goosebumps film made a lot of sense to me, like the television series that also adapted Stine's work. I wrote a review of the film on Out of Frame when it was released, and I more or less said it was everything it needed to be and would be fun for its core audience, eventually rating it a score of decent, or 5 out of 10. I was hopeful they would create a sequel, but I didn't know the likelihood of that happening. The first film made $150 million worldwide with a production budget estimated of around $60 to $80 million, and when you factor in the amount of profit that's divvied up to the theater chains and calculate the amount also invested into marketing the film, there's no way Goosebumps could have broken even on theater sales alone. That said, it seems that the film must have found a second life on the home market and through streaming services, as the new film Goosebumps 2 Haunted Halloween did get greenlit and released, this time with a production budget of about half its first film. Does the film flounder the potential of the Goosebumps franchise, or does it rise to the occasion to deliver something that can be fun for a new era of fans? Goosebumps 2 Haunted Halloween is directed by Ari Sandel and written by Rob Leiber. The director is also known for the Netflix film When We First Met, which I wasn't a fan of, and The Duff. Acting as a direct sequel to the first film, it spins a familiar yarn. Two young boys are outcasted, bullied, and targeted by their classmates, and they like to go treasure hunting, a euphemism for going through old houses and other junk, scrapping it for whatever they can get. They find themselves asked to look through an old abandoned house that happens to have once belonged to R.L. Stine. Looking through the house, they find an old book that ends up with them releasing Slappy the Dummy, who brings to life many Goosebumps monsters to wreak havoc and cause trouble on Halloween night. The story holds a lot of similarities to the previous film, which is a complaint I heard a lot of critics make. I do think it retreads a lot of familiar territory, specifically when the cogs are set in motion and the creatures begin to run roughshod over the town, but I don't think it's enough to really condemn the film for. The two young boys may not offer a wholly unique spin to the film, but they are likable enough, and I think they do offer a different angle than the original trio of characters did in the original film. The film does seem to have some self-awareness to certain retreads, particularly with Jack Black's scenes as R.L. Stine, but being aware of something doesn't absolve you from doing the act. The scenes in the film's allocation of time are less than stellar at its worst. A runtime of 90 minutes is about what a Goosebumps film warrants, until it becomes stretched beyond its means, but this film still manages to feel like it's padding the runtime, and that a lot of scenes could have ended up on the cutting room floor. In one scene, the young boys and their babysitter, one of the boys' sister actually, are in a moment where time is of essence. They decide to dress up as monsters to blend in. The scene thereafter is a nonsensical, tonally inconsistent opportunity for our characters to accessorize, including incorporating forced, unnecessary plot threads to be used for the final half of the film. Along with that, it feels like all of R.L. Stine's scenes could have and should have never happened. Although the film is aware of how unimportant he is to the film's conflict, that doesn't change the fact that the scenes could have been exercised or reworked in a way that either tightened its essential story or shortened the film's length. I'm of the assumption that the reason Jack Black wasn't featured heavily in the film had to do with the film's budget being cut in half. The expenditure of having him in the first place feels even stranger when you consider he was barely featured at all in the promotional content. Perhaps that's because they wanted to avoid appearing similar to the recently released The House with Clock in Its Walls film. Either way, it seems like they would have been better off simply making an in-world Goosebumps film without R.L. Stine. But I suppose hindsight is 20/20. Instead of having Jack Black do the voice work for Slappy the Dummy in this film, they instead opted for Mick Wingert to take the reins of the film. This decision makes a lot of sense when you consider Mick Winger is also known for his uncanny imitation of Jack Black from the Kung Fu Panda cartoon series on Nickelodeon. Unfortunately, I found that Mick hammed it up more than I would have liked, with his repetitive laughter coming off as overbearing. I enjoyed some of the special effects in this film, and in fact, even more than my personal enjoyment of the film, I find my stake in the success of Goosebumps has to do with its willingness to celebrate the horror genre with a younger audience. Although, like its predecessor, the film is very heavy on CGI, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because if it's done well, it can be fantastic, but I find that the way that they do it adds a glossy and authentic quality to some of its characters. Some of them I did think seemed inspired and true to the Halloween spirit. A lot of my criticisms won't apply to the target demographic, but I feel it's still relevant to point out complaints and praise quality in the entertainment provided to younger moviegoers. In some ways, I like Goosebumps Haunted Halloween more than the original Goosebumps, simply because it has more ghoulish nature to it. Unfortunately, because it's lacking storyline, misuse of its own potential, and runtime, I feel compelled to leave it as a below-average 4 out of 10 film. Rabies and Germs, thanks for joining me on this edition of the Out of Frame podcast. This is actually where I'm going to leave you. I hope that you have had a good Halloween, hope you've enjoyed the season, and I hope to see you next time.